So this is the final installment in the calculation of, the creation of, or fabrication of, and finally the setting of an oval stone into a step bezel. So let's go to the bench and get this finished. Okay, so this is annealed. We're going to go ahead and get it ready for soldering. Okay, so I've made my ring blank. I made a full ring blank because what I'm going to do now is cut out the section that I need for the bezel. And in order for me to do that, I am going to measure the width of my bezel, and then I'm also going to make sure that I've got my seam at the top, because I want to cut that portion of the ring out, not the part that was seamless. So I want the seamless part to be what's left of the ring. And I know this is where my solder seam is, so I'm going to mark that. Now, we measured before what the width of my bezel was based on the calculations that we did about the thickness of the two metals together and the soldering, but I'm going to take and remeasure it. And as you can see here, I made a rookie mistake and did not plug in my microphone while I was filming this section of the video. So I figured it would be a good idea for me to re-film it and show you what it was like to work the process when you actually have the microphone plugged in. So on this is the actual ring we're gonna set the stone into, but that's okay. Okay, so I've made a size 6 ring. The black area is where my solder seam is, and I want to cut that portion out so that I have a seamless ring blank. So the width of my bezel is actually 9.46. So I'm going to take out 9.46 millimeters of this ring in order to fit my bezel into the ring shank. So 9.46. I'm going to mark it. I am going to Sharpie the outside edge so I can see my scribe lines. And I'm going around the seam where my solder seam is. I don't want that solder seam in there, so I'm going to take and mark it there. I'm going to test it against my bezel, and that is correct. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out. Now, before you start cutting this, you want to ensure that you're cutting on straight lines, because the edge of my bezel is straight up and down. It's not an angled collet in any direction, so I know it's straight up and down, so I need to make my cuts straight up and down on my ring blank, which is why I scribed straight lines. So now I have an open ring shank, and I can fit my bezel in here and do the soldering. So we are going to go to the soldering board and get that set up for soldering and finish that off. Now I'm going to use medium solder for this operation as well, because I've already used the hard solder on the joints for the bezel itself, and I don't want the solder joints to come apart. Okay, I have the ring out of the pickle, and you notice here I've got a new setup. I have the Benchmate stone setting system, so I use this to do my stone setting because it's a lot easier. I've got two hands I can work with instead of trying to hold the ring in one hand and press down the bezel edge in another. If you don't have this set up, you can use a vise. If you have a small table vise, I would suggest using that. That way you have hands free and you can actually work with both hands. If not, use one hand to hold the material and the other hand to press your sides over. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up. I've got my stone ready. You're going to need a couple of other things besides obviously the stone. You're going to need a bezel rocker, something like this, or if you prefer to use a hammer and punch, you can use a brass punch, with a small hammer, and what you would do is set the punch along the edge of your bezel and hammer it. I prefer to do it by hand using the bezel rocker, so that's what I'm going to use today. The other thing you're going to need is a small piece of wax, or in my case, I have this little wax tip pin that I can use to set my stone in and check the fit. And basically what I do is stick the stone on it. It's kind of cold, so it's not wanting to stick. Ow, just use my fingers. The stone's big enough to just use my fingers. So I'm going to set the stone in place. Now, one note. Before you get to setting the actual stone, you need to do all of your sanding and polishing first, because you want the inside of your stone setting to be as shiny as possible in order to reflect the most light throughout the stone. I'm not going to do that today because this is just a demonstration, but when you're making a piece of jewelry to sell or to give as a gift, file, sand, and polish the inside and the outside of your setting. Do all of your finishing work before you put the stone in. The stone placement and the stone setting is the last thing you should do when constructing your piece. So let's go ahead and get the stone in there. Now, we already set the stone up to fit with the last video, so it should fit in here snugly, but I'm going to double check it and make sure that it's correct still, because we've soldered and it looks like it's a little crooked. So I'm going to make some adjustments here. And of course, my sticky pin is not very sticky. So let's get this out of here. And I can tell my stone's fitting a little bit tight, so I'm just going to do a little bit of adjustment using my ball burr like I did before, and just kind of clean up the inside a little bit. I'm taking off that small little edge on the inside, just making sure that it fits, cleaning up any solder that may have moved during that last solder operation, and just ensuring I've got a snug fit. There we go. Now it's perfectly level. Whoop. Of course it's going to stick to my finger now. Let's check it. Of course it's crooked. There, now it's straight. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my bezel rocker and I'm going to work it north, south, west, or east, west. And that is going to secure the stone in place, and then we'll go in and finish smoothing it around. I use my bezel rocker in the long way first. I'm holding the stone in place so it doesn't pop out on me while I work. Tighten this down a little bit. My ring's moving. Now that I've got my 4 points established, I can go in and change the direction of my bezel rocker and start to press down, even more. And I'm still going to work in opposite corners just to make sure that my stone stays level. Be careful not to slip and break your stone. If you're finding it difficult to press the material over, you can do a couple of things. You can take a file and take it at a 45-degree angle and remove some of the material all the way around. That'll make it a little bit easier to press the bezel over the top of the stone. Don't take off too much material though, because then you'll end up with not enough material to hold the stone in place. So I'm taking it to about half the thickness that it started at. And since I had a pretty thin piece of metal to begin with, it's not going to be very much that I'm taking off. And I'm trying to make sure that it's consistent and even all the way around. And then I'm going to go back in with my bezel rocker. And if you have to, make smaller increments. One thing to note, I'm not pressing straight side by side this way. I'm actually taking it at about a 45-degree angle and pressing the bezel over, because it does two things. It helps with the slipping. You notice I'm still slipping a little bit, but that's okay. I'm trying to do this a little bit too fast. Normally I would slow way down and just take my time and do this, but for some reason I'm kind of amped up today. Anyway, take your time. Go at about a 45-degree angle and push inward at about a 45-degree angle. And that's how you're going to get your best push against the bezel. Instead of going straight across this way, you're trying to press too much metal all at one time. It's better to take it at about a 45-degree angle and work your way around slowly. Plus, I gotta lift this up just a smidge because it's a little bit low for me. And as I'm working my way around, I'm looking for any buckles or wrinkles or anything that might make the setting look unfinished. Trying to keep it as finished and as proper as I can get it. I'm also checking from the side here to make sure that the stone is staying level. And when you're finished, you should have just a slight bit of a protrusion over the top of the stone should stick up just slightly higher than your bezel. Not too much and not too little, because then that exposes the stone to breakage and cracking if you bang it on something. And so you want the stone to be kind of protected by the bezel itself. So you have it set down in there. The table can be either even with the top of the bezel or just a slight bit higher. My preference is to make it even with the top of the bezel so that the stone is protected. But it's aesthetically up to you how you'd like to do that. That looks pretty good. I look on my side, it's level all the way around. So now I can finish with some cleanup on the outside of my bezel, because I used the file a little bit and I need to clean that area up just a little bit. So I'm going to use some sandpapers, and I'm going to use my 800 grit sandpaper to clean up the edge, being very careful not to touch the stone because I don't want to scratch the stone. And once you've got that cleaned up, you can always go back and repolish, and just be very careful not to touch the top of the stone. If it's more comfortable for you, you can throw a piece of masking tape over the top of the stone to protect it a little bit more, keep you from slipping off the edge. But for the most part, it should be okay as long as you've set the stone deep enough into the bezel. Now I'm also going to take it and go over it this way, because I want the edges where I place the tool on my bezel to be cleaned up. I don't want there to be scratch marks on the bezel. So first I want to sand them out, and then I'll use my polishing buff to actually clean up the sand marks. And since I'm using an 800 grit sandpaper, it'll be nice and clean. That looks pretty good. I'm going to take my polishing mop in my Flux shaft and clean that up just a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I didn't do a lot of cleanup before I set the stone, which is why it's very important to do all of your polishing and cleanup before you set the stone, because you don't want to have to go back in and try and fix that after the stone has been set, because you have more opportunities to damage the stone. I'm just going to do a little bit so you can get the gist of how shiny and how clear you want that setting to be. Now I'm just using a red rouge on a polishing mop, a cotton polishing mop. That looks pretty good. I'm going to go a little bit higher on the setting. I'm being very careful not to touch my stone, because even though this is a pretty high grit abrasive, it can still scratch the stone. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, the last thing I would suggest doing is getting a graver, a flat graver, and cleaning up the inside of your bezel near the stone, because there will be some scratch marks or some leftover file marks or sandpaper marks or even polishing marks. And in order to truly produce a nice quality piece of work, the little bit of extra time that it takes to clean up some of these smaller details makes all of the difference. I know as a jeweler, when I buy jewelry, I tend to be over scrutinizing of the details, and you know, that sometimes is not a good thing, but the quality itself will speak for itself when you take a little bit of extra time to clean up your bezel. So I just use a little hand graver. I am an engraver, so I have a bunch of different tools, but if you don't have one, the one thing I would recommend doing is investing in just a push handle and a flat graver, because the flat graver is going to help you clean up the interior of the edges. And the way I do that is I take my graver at a 45-degree angle and I just slightly cut off the edge, the inside edge of my bezel. And what that does is it polishes it and it cleans it up so that there aren't any sharp edges to catch on a sweater or, you know, grab a hold of anything from the outside. And I just do that very slowly, take my time and go around because I don't want to slip and cut the stone or scratch the stone. And that one extra step can make all the difference in the final look of your setting. Okay, that looks good. So one more time with the polishing mop. There we go. Now it's done. Double check it. Looks good. It's level. And there's the final setting. Of course, my project is not completely finished because there's no polishing or anything on the ring itself, but I would take the time before I set my stone to clean up any imperfections on the outside of the ring shank itself, on the underneath. The extra step you can also do is to take a half round file and file the interior, so a small half round file, and just file the interior to make it slightly recessed so that it would fit on the finger a little more comfortably. But that's essentially how you would bezel set an oval stone. So this week we made a ring shank. We opened it up to fit our bezel setting into it, and then finally we got to setting that oval shaped faceted stone into the step bezel that we created over the past couple of weeks. So I'm really happy we finally got to this point. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and if it is, remember to give me a like. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I'd love to hear from you. And I thank you for watching this week, and I will see you next week. Bye, everybody.